Hi everyone, my name is Shazia Khan, and the unit that we'll be doing today is Industrial and Intellectual Property Law. And the element of the session today is to look at the assignment discussion. So we've done all 4 learning outcomes, and now we'll be referring to the assignment discussion. Before I go into the assignment discussion, I want to just give you an idea, summary of each of the learning outcome that we've done, quite a quick summary so that we can go into the assignment discussion and discuss that. Okay, so we look at first at learning outcome 1, which we looked at understanding the underlying rules relating to intellectual property law. So that was the introduction to it in learning outcome 1. We looked at the introduction to what intellectual property was and why it's so important in regards to, the creation of the mind, such as, people inventing things, any sort of artistic work, symbols, names, images, and why that's so important in intellectual property, and why the person that's created it or invented it has intellectual property exclusive rights and protection for his invention. We went on to look at understanding intellectual property rights. So what are intellectual property rights? Why are intellectual property rights so important? Challenges with intellectual property rights and best practices for protecting any sort of intellectual property rights. We looked at types of intellectual property. So we looked at, it could be things like, patents, trademarks, copyright, and trade secrets. And we looked at things like, a trade secret could be a popular example, could be the one of Coca-Cola, where they've protected their ingredients and their trade secret in regards to how Coca-Cola tastes and the image around it. We went on to look at patents, why that was so important in regards to legal right granted to invent something. We went on to look at trademarks and the importance of trademarks. Copyright and why that was so important, and how long the protection lasts for in copyright, which is the life of the author plus an additional 70 years. We looked at trade secrets, and again, the example of Coca-Cola and Google is another one that you could protecting any sort of trade secrets and safeguarding it. We then went on in learning outcome 1 to look at intellectual property law, enforcement, infringement, briefly in regards to some remedies and things like that. This will be elaborated more in learning outcome 4. And then we went on to look at the term intellectual property, why that's so important, why why that term is used, and what does the concept mean. We then went on to look at categories of intellectual property. So that was patents, trademarks, copyright, and trade secrets. We then went on to look at the importance of intellectual property and the protection that's available for it, such as the Berne Convention, the Paris Convention, and the European Intellectual Property Act. We looked at challenges in intellectual property as well, counterfeiting, piracy. And then we looked at the subject matters of intellectual property rights. So the creation of the mind, patents, how long they can be protected for. We looked at trademarks and copyrights protection and trade secrets protection. We then went on to look at evaluating the types of intellectual property and associated laws in place with them. So for patents and patent laws, we looked at the Patents Act 1977, which is governed by. For trademarks, we had the Trademark Acts 1994. For the law for copyright, we had the copyright laws such as the Copyright Design and Patents Act 1988. We then went on to trade secrets and looked at the Trade Secrets Enforcement Regulations 2018, which was the legal framework in the UK for protection of trade secrets. Other rights we looked at was things like the Registration Design Act 1949 and Plant Variety Protect New Plant Variety Acts 1997. We then went on to look at analysing the impacts of intellectual property and public interest. So we looked at positive impacts on public interest, things like encouraging innovation, economic growth, quality assurance, and we looked at negative impacts as well, things like access to medicine, knowledge of dissemination, and monopolies. We then looked at case studies on intellectual property interests and looked at issues related to breach of confidentiality in intellectual property, types of confidentiality for trade secrets, you know, the formulas, proprietary information, technical information, and we looked at the legal framework for protecting information, cybersecurity threats, employee breach, non-disclosure agreements. We then went on in learning outcome 1 to look at case studies of breach of confidentiality, things like the Apple and Samsung 2012, Waymo and Uber case as well, and identified elements of that. So that was learning outcome 1 that we looked at. The next learning outcome we looked at was learning outcome 2, and that looked at elements of understanding the associated laws and procedures related to copyright and trademarks and the impact of jurisprudence of EU intellectual property law on the UK. So that was an understanding of the regulatory and legislative elements. So we looked at here the introduction to copyright and trademark law, and why there was an importance to have that in place. We looked at trademark law and the enforceability. We looked at the impact of EU intellectual property on laws, things as Brexit, the Court of Justice, cross-border enforcement laws in place. We looked at the underlying principles of copyright, and we looked at the importance of safeguarding copyright. Copyright laws in the UK, so it was a Copyright Design and Patents Act in more detail. We looked at international copyright, which was the World Intellectual Property WIPO, and the copyright treaties in regards to international copyright laws. We looked at the comparison of UK and international copyright laws. We also, in Learning Outcome 2, looked at the enforcement of copyright laws. And we looked at the framework of trademark law as operated in the UK, Europe, and internationally, and look at why trademark law plays a fundamental role in protecting brands and their distinctive symbols and logos. We then went to look at trademark law in the UK under the Trademark Acts 1994, and we looked at trademark law in Europe, such as the EU trademark regulations, EU 2017-1001, and we looked at the regulation under European Union Intellectual Property Offices, EU IPO, providing businesses to register EU trademarks. We looked at the Paris Convention and the Berne Convention. We looked at key elements of trademark, why they were so important in regards to companies having a distinctiveness, infringement, and registration. We also looked at the enforcement of trademarks, and we looked at limits, enforcement, infringement of copyright and trademark. We looked at briefly on the civil and criminal enforcement and the legal ramifications. And then we looked at fair competition and innovation and what that meant within copyright and trademark law. That was learning outcome 2. We then went on to look at learning outcome 3, which was looking at understanding the different forms of industrial property rights. We looked at justifications for intellectual property, and we looked at the advocate case, which was also known as the Irving Warnick case, and what was identified in that case, why that case was so important in regards to intellectual property. We then went on to look at licensed innovation and why it was so important to get it registered. We then went on to look at the law of industrial designs and why that was so important. in regards to intellectual property. We then went on to look at examples of intellectual property. We also looked at comparing and contrasting UK law, national registered design right and unregistered design right, and the difference between each one in regards to intellectual property. We also looked at how the IPO illustrates how a plan right or copyright owner can apply for change of conditions of the license, and why the IPO needs to be involved in the 5-year, they should grant a 5-year permit. We then went on to identify that unregistered plan freedoms might be difficult to show because of the duration of time and because of the elements of not having enough documentation. And that was looking at learning outcome 3, sorry. We then went on to learning outcome 4, which looked at understanding the remedies available for breach of intellectual property law. So here, what we looked at the criminal side and the civil side in more detail, any sort of sanctions, misuse of intellectual properties. We looked at remedies available, injunction, damages, imprisonment dependent on the case, the severity of the case. We looked at patent prosecution, and we looked at remedies in relation to in the international context. So what remedies were available, what laws are in place, and how the laws are different in every territory, and every jurisdiction has different laws on intellectual property and how they would protect individuals. So we looked at the protection of individuals in learning outcome 4. We also looked at the breaches as well, and what remedies and sanctions are in place, fines, imprisonment, and looked at the element of the remedies, but also looked at damages and looked at the costs that are involved in regards to this. And in the international context, we looked at things like, the Berne Convention, the Paris Convention, and also looked at things like, the WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, how that protects individuals, but also why organizations need to be registered if they want to trade with a different country, and why they need to protect their intellectual property, why it's so important, and what sanctions and remedies are in place in regards to that. So, breaching or infringing, anything like that. So that's a quick overview of the 4 learning outcomes quickly, and then we're now going to go into the assignment discussion. So the assignment discussion, the aim of the unit, so just to establish that the aim of the unit is to enable learners to gain an understanding of regulatory and legislative requirements relating to industrial and intellectual property. And that we've done throughout learning outcome 1, 2, 3, and 4. Learners will examine relevant issues, including financial strategy, debt, and equity management, the key drivers of shareholder value, corporate governance, and asset portfolio management. And that we've looked at in regards to when we've done each learning outcome and the importance of that. So I'll just go back to that. So what information needs to go on the assignment? So before you start the assignment, start working on the assignment, you need to have your name on the assignment. It's so important that the person reading it is able to understand that it's your work. You need to identify that it's your work. You need to have your registration number on it, and you need to have the case the unit level, and in this case it'll be industrial and intellectual property assignment. You then need to have an assignment declaration, and this is so important because this identifies that the assignment that you are submitting is your own work, and that you are acknowledging that it is your own work, because it's so important. If you look at the requirements, it actually tells you the declaration. You are signing a declaration, submitting that this is your work, and the penalties note that you understand the definition of penalties for any sort of cheating, collusion, and plagiarism are set out in the policies, and you are declaring that this is your work. So it's really important to identify this, because you need to make sure that you're moving away from doing any work on AI. Okay, and that's the big issue in regards to plagiarism or collusion. And you need to make sure that your plagiarism is under 20% to identify that this is your own work. Make sure you are referencing your work. When it comes to collusion and plagiarism, in some parts, it's not that you've used AI, it may be the fact that you've not referenced your work properly. And we'll go through that in regards to it later on, how in regards to referencing, using websites online, things as Neil's Toolbox or Cite Me, that will help you reference. So make sure you're doing in-text referencing, and you provide a reference list or a bibliography towards the end of the assignment as well, to identify that it's your work, you've used these sources, and you've not colluded or there's no forms of plagiarism. And that's, I will reiterate this as much as I can going through this assignment. So at the start of the assignment, you need a table of contents, and a table of contents identifying what you're doing in each element, okay, and which page allows you to do this. Font size 12, a 1.5 line spacing, page numbers to be inserted, and it's really important because when you'll have your table of contents, it will identify your page numbers. An introduction is needed to just identify what you will be doing at the start of the assignment. Make sure that you are putting all the assessment criteria ACE in headings. So, for example, if you are doing the assessment criteria for 1.1, you need to make sure you are doing ACE 1.1. And I will go through that more with you so you've got a better idea. Learning outcomes. So as we've said, there were 4 learning outcomes, which I summarized at the start, but these are the learning outcomes that we've gone through. Firstly, we looked at understanding the underlying rules relating to intellectual property laws. We also looked at learning outcome 2, which was to understand the associated laws and procedures relating to copyright and trademark laws, and the impact of jurisprudence of EU intellectual property on the UK. We then went on to learning outcome 3, which was to understand the different forms of industrial property rights. And then finally, learning outcome 4, to understand the remedies available for breach of intellectual property. And we looked at them in regards to identifying certain elements of intellectual property, but there was lots of overlap with them in regards to remedies, the laws in place, both internationally and nationally, and we looked at the elements of intellectual property for you to get on and do this assignment as well. So if you need to refer to any of the learning outcomes, the recorded lectures will be on Moodle for you. So we're going into the tasks now. So the first task, there's 3 tasks, and this is task 1 of 3. Unit learning outcomes 1 and 2 to be used to complete this task. So you need to be looking at your PowerPoint slides for unit learning outcome 1 and 2 to complete this. Learning outcome 1 is to understand the underlying rules relating to intellectual property laws, and learning outcome 2 is to understand the associated laws and procedures relating to copyright and trademark laws and the impact of jurisprudence of EU intellectual property on the UK. And these will help you towards completing task 1. So in task 1, based on your research of the legislations listed below, justify the requirement for intellectual property rights to be protected. So you will be looking at the Paris Convention, 1883, Berne Convention, the Rome, 1961, TRIPS, 1994, EU Articles 34 and 36, which is the Treaty of Functioning of the EU Consolidated TFEU. So the expectation is that you must ensure in your report, so there's 5 parts to the task 1, okay? Firstly, you must ensure that you are looking at analysing the term intellectual property. And this is what you will be doing in your assignment. So once it's asking you task, so you will have a heading as task 1, and then you will have the number 1, analyse the term intellectual property. Put that as a heading. Do not change the wording around. Identify what it's saying as it's saying. If you start changing it, use the command words there, analyze, explain, evaluate. Use them as a heading and then answer underneath. So you will look at analysing the term intellectual property. You will start writing about that underneath that, okay? Number 2, you will be looking, so that's part 1 done. Part 2 of it, you will be explaining subject matters of intellectual property rights, and then right under that, answer that question. So you'll be explaining subject matters of intellectual property rights. Number 3, you will be evaluating types of intellectual property and associated laws. So that's another part that is going to be a heading, okay? And then number 4, you're going to critically analyze the impacts of intellectual property on public interest. So that's another part of it. And then number 5 analyzes issues relating to the breach of confidential information in intellectual property. So there's 5 parts to this task 1. You need to make sure that each part has a heading. So number 1 is a heading, and then you write your answer under it. Number 2 is a heading, and then you write your answer under it. Number 3 is a heading, and you write your answer under it. And number 4 is a heading, and you will write your answer under it. And number 5 is a heading, and you will write your answer under it. Make sure you have them in your report. The submission is in the form of a report, so it's a Word format. Make sure that the word limit is 1,200 words for each 5 elements. So each 5 of them will be 1,200 words altogether. So maybe, you know, look at doing maybe 2,000, just if you 1,200 words, so 200, maybe 200 and, yeah, 225, maybe 250 words for each one, because you have the 10% leeway as well, okay? So for the task 1, the recommended word limit is 1,200 words, and that is excluding any diagrams, references, and appendices, okay? And it needs to be done in a Word format. Learners are expected to adhere to the word count, and you have a 10% leeway either side of this range is permitted before the assessor who is marking the work is going to stop reading at that point. So you need to make sure that you are looking at the 10% leeway as well. Make sure everything is under a heading, and make sure you are prioritizing your time word count. Where to find the answer for task 1-1? So task assessment criteria to be covered. So the answers for the 5 parts in task 1, you could find in learning outcome 1, which is 1.1 assessment criteria, 1.2, 1.3, 1.4, and 1.5. And 2.3 and 2.4 to complete the whole of task 1 of 3. The example that I'm going to give you, so we're going to give you an example of a task. I'm just pulling one out. So the first one is analyze the term intellectual property and where you can find that on your slides. So you would go to learning outcome 1, page 5 onwards. And it's literally on page 5 onwards up to page 15, looks at intellectual property and what it is and what the term actually means. So that's where you would go on to look at answering. That was just an example so that you have an idea of where you need to go on. But for completing task 1, you need to look at learning outcome 1 and learning outcome 2. Task 2 of 3. So here is where we're going to look at task 2. So as we mentioned, there's 3 tasks, but this is on task 2. So unit learning outcomes 2. Understand the associated laws and procedures relating to copyright and trademark laws and the impact of jurisprudence of EU law, intellectual property law on the UK. So here, this is task 2. So assignment brief and guidance for task 2 of 3. Based on the contents of Copyright Act 1988, CDPR, Part 1, produce a report which reviews all 8 categories of the copyright works covered by the legislation. You must ensure the report looks at number 1, analyzes the underlying principles of copyright. Number 2, compares and contrasts the forms of copyright laws in the UK and internationally. And number 3, evaluate limits, enforcement, and infringement of copyright and trademarks. You need to make sure that when you are looking at this, that you are having, again, like we said, as headings, okay? So you need to make sure that you are analyzing the underlying principles of copyright as one heading, and then writing the answer under that. Then number 2, compare and contrast the forms of copyright laws in the UK and internationally as one heading, and writing about that under that. And then number 3, evaluates limits, enforcement, and infringement of copyright and trademark, and then write under that. So each bit needs to be a heading, and this is task 2 of 3. So you need to make sure that you are using these headings, but you are using the command words that are there, the exact wording. Do not change it, just identify it as that. For these 3 parts, the submission again is a form of report written in Word format. The recommended word limit here is 1,200 words for the 3 parts. So as there's 3 parts, there's 1,200 words to do for each one. So if you're looking at it, do 400 words each for part 1. Looking at the underlying principles of copyright principles is 400 words. Part 2, compare and contrast the forms of copyright laws in the UK and internationally, 400 words. And then evaluate limits, enforcement, infringement of copyright and trademark, another 400 words. So make sure you're using it as a heading, each one, and make sure you're answering to and excluding direct diagrams, references, appendices. So you're looking at 1,200 words altogether for task 2. Again, you are expected to adhere to the word count, and a 10% leeway range is permitted before the assessor stops reading. An example I've picked out from task 2 is, the task 2, the assessment criteria to be covered is learning outcome 2, 2.1, 2.2, 2.3, and 2.4 to answer task 2. The example that I've picked out for task 2 is looking at comparing and contrasting the forms of copyright laws in the UK and internationally, and where to find that. So for that one, you will need to go to Learning Outcome 2, and it's on page 12 onwards to look at the comparison of UK and international law. Look at things like the Berne Convention. You need to refer to elements of issues around, where you're looking at page 12, and it would go from there onwards. So you'd look at the Berne Convention, you'd look at copyright law in different countries, you'd look at the enforcement bit, you'd look at intellectual property office as well. So you'd look at it in regards to that, and then identify, the international laws as well, trademark laws in international countries, what they are, and then look at the maybe look at the EU ones as well. So the EU trade mark regulations and how it differs from the UK law. So you have the Paris Convention here that you could look at as well. The international registration of trademarks. So how you would protect them, and how it would be across internationally as well. So the final one is task 3 of 3. So here unit learning outcome 3 and 4 is to be used to complete task 3. So you need to use unit learning outcome 3 and 4 to complete this task. So learning outcome 3 is to understand the different forms of industrial property rights. And learning outcome 4 is to understand the remedies available for breach of intellectual property law. So the assignment brief and guidance for task 3 of 3. So we've looked at task 1 and 2. This is task 3. So based on the decisions in the following cases, produce a report which focuses on how the decisions interpreted the tort of passing off in the context of trademark infringement. Look at the case of Evan and Warnick against Townsend, which we looked at in learning outcome 4. Reckitt and Coleman and Borden, 1919. Irvine and Talksport, 2002. And BT PLC against 1 in a Million, 1999. So these are focusing on these cases, produce a report. So task 3 here. You must ensure that in the report that you have, there's 3 parts to the report. Critically analyze the justifications for intellectual property. So look at why there's a need for the justification for intellectual property. So that would be part 1, and you would have that as a heading, and you would write under there. So critically analyze. So it's telling you to critically look deeper rather than define or explain deeper. Look at it for the justification of it. Analyzes the law of industrial designs. So make sure you're looking at what industrial design is and analyzing the law around it, why it's so important. And that would be a heading, and then you would write under that. And then number 3, compare and contrast the UK National Registered Design right with an unregistered design right system. So you would look at the comparing each one. So what's the difference between registered design right and unregistered design right, and comparing and contrasting. So if there's a difference between them, why there's a difference between them, and look at that. So that would be the third part that you would look at, but you need to make sure that is a heading as well. Delivery and submission is in the form of a report written in the Word format again. The recommended word limit is 600 words. So for each part, you've got 3 parts there, haven't you? 600 words, so it would be about 500 words each, 500 and maybe 550 words, maybe around that. And look at each bit for that and identify elements of each part. So, make sure, because this is one of the ones that is the largest word count. So you've got the first 2 tasks with 1,200 words each. This is 1,600 because it's more detailed, critically analysing, comparing and contrasting. So it's more, so it's 1,600 words in the task 3. You need to make sure you are sticking to the word count and that you do have the 10% leeway as well. So if you write a little bit more with examples and things. So when it says look at critically analysing, put in some examples as well. Also, the whole word count for the whole 3 tasks is 4,000 words. So 1,200 words for the task 1, 1,200 words for the task 2, and 1,600 words for task 3. Make sure you, again, and I will reiterate this, that you are using each part of it as a heading. Where to find the information for task 3 of 3. So you would look at assessment criteria 4.1 and 4.2. And I'll give you another example. So we looked at an example in task 3, we pulled one out, and it was to compare and contrast the UK law national registered design right with an unregistered design right. And where you would find this would be, you'd go to learning outcome 3, page 11 onwards, which looks at, compares and contrasts. So this task is, as we mentioned at the start, covers from learning outcome 3 and 4, and that looks at UK law registered design right with unregistered design right. At the end of the assignment, so that's all the tasks gone through. So at the end of the assignments, make sure you do a conclusion. Make sure you produce a reference list or a bibliography. Note that I've provided you with an example for each task and identified where to find the task information to complete them. You need to do all the tasks, and also you need to do any additional reading to evaluate and support your answers. So you need to do all the tasks. So task 1, task 2, task 3, and elements of each task. Again, make sure, and I reiterate this so many times, that you have each one as a heading as well, because it's so important. And make sure you are looking them, make sure it's clear which parts of the tasks are which ones. So as you're doing each element of the task, that you are making it clear that you have done this as a heading. Referencing for all tasks, you should use and cite a range of case law, academic and reliable sources. A comprehensive Harvard-style list must be included at the end of the work. Make sure you're doing in-text referencing, and make sure you're using references in the references that you use, because the sources are so important. Again, going down to collusion and plagiarism, you need to make sure that you are referencing all your work, because it would be an element of plagiarism, or and avoid using AI to help you do this. You could look at AI to maybe help you explain a concept, then reword it in your own words, or write something like that. It's just to explain concepts, because it would come up as plagiarism and collusion. Learners must show knowledge and understanding of the subject area. You must provide references to the relevant case law or legislation wherever appropriate, and you must be able to support your answers and show evidence of your wider reading appropriately. And that would be any sort of additional reading that is on Moodle, that we've put on Moodle, that you need to refer to answer the questions and the tasks. A summary of what kind of needs to be done in your assignment. So make sure, again, and I reiterate this introduction and a conclusion, because it introduces the concept of what you're doing at the start and then ends it with a conclusion. Make sure you are using Harvard system for referencing. And you can refer to online sites that help you, make the reference and put the dots and the commas in the right place. So an example would be Neil's Toolbox, which is used by a lot of students and is one that looks at things like referencing books, referencing articles, referencing websites, referencing journals, referencing any sort of other sources, such as, it might be literature sources, any sources like journal articles or parts of a book. It references everything for you. So it helps you, tells you where to put the details, and then it makes it up for you. So you're able to put it in the referencing list towards the end. If you're using diagrams, please make sure you reference them accordingly, because there's no point putting a diagram in that doesn't make sense. It needs to be referenced accordingly. Make sure you have a bibliography reference list and it is in alphabetical order. But I have realized that people have done some really good references and used good bibliographies in reference lists, but the references are not in alphabetical order. And if you're using cases, make sure you are fully citing cases with the reference towards the end. So it could be Smith versus Hughes, 365, QB 123, and that's the full citation of the reference of the case, and that identifies academically, that you're able to fully cite cases. Try to use more examples when explaining certain concepts. For example, when looking at theories, when looking at cases, and when you're looking at the area around intellectual property, and you're mentioning something around, looking at trade secrets, you could look at examples such as Coca-Cola, Google, Apple, these kind of examples, and give examples around them, and there are cases around them. So, make sure you are using examples, because it builds up your understanding of the area. And remember, this is a level 7 area, so you need to bring up more examples, and analysis and critically analysing needs to be more examples. Make sure you are using the assessment criteria as a heading for each part of the task. For example, if you're looking at task 1 and looking at AC 1.1, each part of the task should be done as a heading and answered under the heading, like I mentioned. And that is the same thing that will be going in your contents page. So if you do task 1, put all the elements in. Do task 2, put all the elements in your contents page. Do task 3, put all the elements in. Then you know which page they're on, and you are using the exact wording, the command wording, rather than drifting away and putting what you want to put in. So use the command wording that is in there, because that is the wording that you should be using. So it's easier for the assessor to mark the work knowing you've covered the assessment criteria. Okay, so making sure that you've covered the assessment criteria, but also making sure you've completed that part of the assessment criteria. So you need to make sure that you are putting the headings in and what you've done. Because sometimes people tend to put in words that they want to put in, rather than the wording that's asking for the tasks, the tasks that you need to do. So put the wording of the tasks in there. So if it says critically analyze, put that in, don't put analyze. If it says explain, don't put in define. You need to put in what the command words are. You need to be referring to the indicative context all the time and checking the word count. And for this assignment, as we mentioned, the word count is 4,000 words. So the task 1, 1,200 words, task 2, 1,200 words, and task 3, 1,600 words. So useful tips. Again, read the tasks carefully. Focus on the details. Focus on what you are being asked. Do not just answer it as you would answer it. Look at what it's asking you. Look at the word limit, how much you have to do. Look at how to do it. Okay, some command verbs, as we look going through command verbs. Explain, define, describe could be like up to 100 words, so it's very brief. Assess, examine, clarify, and analyze. 100 to 125, compare, contrast, critically evaluate, like we've looked, 200 plus words. So you need to make sure you are looking at the command words and using the command words that are being asked of you in the tasks, rather than putting words that you want to put in. Harvard referencing, again, a really, really important part. In text, if you are doing something in text, so in the assignment, if you are writing the author, you need to put in the author and the date, okay? The full citation will go in the bibliography towards the end, but in your in-text, you would put, for example, Slack, Johnston, Brandon Jones, 2011. That's in text in the actual assignment. So that would help you with referencing, and it's academically, you need to do it like that. And also it will help you with your plagiarism, that you've taken something out of here and you've referenced it. If you don't reference it, then you are saying that's your work and it's collusion. In the reference towards the end, it will come as shown. So it would be it will be the full thing. So it would be your author, the date, the name of the book, the edition, and it would be where it was published and the publishing place. So that would be in the reference list. And in the main text, you would just put the author and the date and the style, okay? Word limits, again, 4,000 words, as we said. It could be 3,500 and plus. Give proper headings and subheadings. Again, subheading. Avoid using bullet points. It's an academic piece of work. It can't be used bullet points. Avoid listing things. Make sure your document is structured well and flows well and is presentable and professional. Plagiarism or tolerance, similarity must be below 20%, as I mentioned earlier as well. Make sure it's below 20%, so it identifies there's no forms of collusion, no plagiarism, as you are signing a declaration at the start. Plenary, so you need to make sure you are not copying and pasting work, as is plagiarism. Avoid copying and pasting and would lead to academic misconduct. So you need to make sure the work that you are doing, you are referencing, and avoid using things like AI to do the work. Make sure you reference all your sources, again, referencing Harvard referencing system. If you struggle, you've got Neil's toolbox that could help you develop and work around it. So referencing any internet sources, referencing any newspaper articles, referencing any journal articles, anything, parts of books. So make sure you do that. Make sure you check your grammar and spelling and don't use the American style spelling. If you're doing organization, have a S in it instead of a Z. So make sure you're checking your spelling. It needs to be academically flowing. Refer to ebooks and journals or any sort of additional reading on Moodle for this unit. So make sure you're referring to that to help you, get on with the unit and do more work around the unit. Any inquiries in regards to the assignment or any learning outcome or anything is learnerwork@ukvarsity.co.uk. Submission of the assignment to be done on learnerwork@ukvarsity.co.uk. And the assignment submission is after 2 weeks of completion of the unit and its delivery. So now that the unit is completed, you have 2 weeks to submit the assignment. Make sure you are reading the tasks. This is the assignment discussion. This will be on Moodle for you as well. I'll just refer you to the actual assignment brief, so you've got a little bit of an idea what it looks like. But everything is in the assignment discussion slides anyway. So this is the assignment brief, which would also be on Moodle. It just gives you a little bit about the aims, about the unit itself, what is expected of you, the assessment criteria that you must follow. So 1.1, determine intellectual property, explain so these are the assessment criteria. On the learning outcomes are on the end, and then within the learning outcome is the assessment criteria, so what you need to be looking at in regards to completing this assignment, okay? So they are on the side, which is 1.1, to 1.2, 1.3, 1.4, 1.5, and that is what you need to be putting as your heading for each one. So if you're doing anything on 1.1, you need to put the 1.1, analyze the term intellectual property, 1.2, explain the subject matters of intellectual property rights, and on for each one that you need to do. So the tasks are here, and the tasks are telling you where it would all be covered. So the first task would be on learning outcome 1 and 2, where you'd be looking at the 5 elements there. And then you would look at task 2, which is looking at learning outcome 2 and 2.1, 2.3 and 2.5, and that would answer the 3 parts there, and the word count is there as well for you to look at on the assignment brief, and it would look at what you need to do in each 3. So make sure that each one is a heading so that the individual is able to understand, and the word count is there, and the actual information to complete it. Task 3 is learning outcome 3, and 4, that will cover task 3. So you need to look at 3.1, 3.2, 3.3, 4.1 and 4.2. And this is looking at the assignment task for 3 parts there, and the word count is there, which is 1600 words. It will show you what you need to do, but you need to make sure you have a contents page, you have an introduction, and every part of it is under a heading. And I reiterate that again, referencing. So this assignment brief is on Moodle as well, so that you could have a look at this. If you need to put the unit title in, the unit level, unit reference number, you would put that into your assignment at the start, where your name is and the unit name as well. So make sure you are looking at the assignment discussion, and make sure that you are covering all the elements of the assignment discussion that we've gone through. Again, if you have any questions around the assignment, or if you have any questions around the learning outcomes or anything else, email learnerwork@ukvarsity.co.uk. Use the additional reading and the references and the ebooks on Moodle, and they will help you support your answers. So now we've finished the assignment discussion. We've done learning outcome 1, 2, 3 and 4 on this module, which is the industrial and intellectual property law, and we've completed the 4 learning outcomes and the assignment discussion. Thank you for attending the session today, and good luck with completing your assignment. Thank you.